She told her friends at my retirement dinner, right in front of me. He's a good man, but not the kind you build a life with. I'm just here until something better comes along. My daughter heard it first. Then I did. I put down my fork, folded my napkin, and said goodnight to everyone at the table. That was 11 days ago. She's left 47 messages since. I'm 64 years old. I've lived a full life, raised 2 kids, mostly on my own after my wife passed. Built a small plumbing business from nothing. Sold it at 61. Bought a modest house in Taronga, with a view of the harbor that I never take for granted. I wasn't looking for anyone when I met Audrey. She found me, really, at a community fundraiser out in Tepuka. I was volunteering at the Sausage Sizzle. She was there with a friend, laughed at something I said, and that was that. She was 51 at the time. I was 62. I knew the gap existed. People mentioned it, of course my sister especially. But Audrey seemed like a grounded woman. She'd been through her own difficulties. A long marriage that ended badly. Estrangement from one of her kids. She talked about wanting something real, something steady. And I believed her. That's the part I have to sit with now. We were together for nearly 2 years. She moved into my house about 9 months in, contributed to groceries, some of the power bill, nothing more, which was fine. I'd never asked for anything. The house was paid off. I wasn't keeping score. That was my mistake. Maybe. Not keeping score while she was keeping a completely different kind of ledger. My eldest daughter, Rosalind, organized the retirement dinner. I'd officially wound down the last of my consultancy work, and she wanted to market properly. Booked a private room at a restaurant on the Strand, invited about 18 people, close family, a few old mates. My neighbor Jeff, who I've known for 30 years. Audrey was there, of course. Sat beside me. Smiled through the entrees. The speeches were done. People were milling about, getting dessert, refilling glasses. I'd stepped away to use the bathroom and came back through the side hallway. That's when I heard it. Audrey was talking to 2 women I didn't know well, friends she'd brought along, which I'd been fine with. She didn't know many people there. Her voice carried. She wasn't whispering. He's a good man, honestly. Sweet. But he's not. He's not what you build a future with, you know? He's comfortable. I'm just here, while I sort myself out, until something better comes along. One of her friends laughed quietly. The other said, "You're terrible." Audrey said, "I'm practical." I stood in that hallway for what felt like a full minute. I wasn't shaking. I wasn't angry. Not in the hot way. It was more like something cold and quiet settled into my chest. Like the way the harbor looks just before a southerly comes in. Everything goes flat and still, and you just know. I walked back into the room. Found Rosalind first. Whispered to her that I wasn't feeling well. Asked her to thank everyone on my behalf. Told her I'd explain later. She looked at my face and didn't ask questions. My daughter is sharp. Always has been. I said goodnight to Jeff. Said goodnight to my son-in-law. Then I went to Audrey, who was back at our table by then. Completely relaxed. Swirling her wine. "I'm heading off," I said. Not feeling the best. She started to stand. "I'll come with you." "No," I said. "Stay. Enjoy the evening." I drove home. Sat in my driveway for a while looking at the harbor lights. Then I went inside, made a cup of tea, and started thinking clearly. The first thing I did was text my son, Edmund. He's a solicitor based in Auckland. Does mostly property and tenancy law. I told him I needed to talk in the morning. No urgency, just when he had a moment. Then I went to bed. I slept better than I had in months, which told me something. Edmund rang me at 7:30 the next morning. I told him everything. He listened without interrupting, which is something I've always appreciated about him. "Right," he said, when I finished. So she's not on the title. Not on any bills. No tenancy agreement of any kind. Nothing. I just let her settle in. Then she has no legal claim to the property, he said. She's a guest. Technically, you'd need to give her a reasonable amount of notice to vacate. Could be as little as a week in these circumstances, but there's nothing complicated here. You're clear, Dad. I appreciated that. Not the legal part, though that was useful. Just hearing him say, "You're clear." Audrey had been at the dinner until late, then apparently stayed at one of her friends' places. She came home mid-morning, and when she got to the door, found that the code on the lockbox had been changed. I'd done that first thing, before Edmund called. Old-fashioned deadbolt. I changed the actual key as well. Locksmith came at 8. Charged me extra for the early hour. Didn't care. I opened the door when she knocked. She looked confused more than anything. The code wasn't working. I changed it, I said. A pause. Why? Because I heard what you said last night. At dinner. About me being something to pass through, while you wait for something better. Her face did something complicated. Not guilt, exactly. More like irritation at being caught, which told me everything I needed to know about what was underneath. That was taken out of context. She said, I've thought about this moment a lot since. She hadn't even taken a breath. Hadn't flinched. Just went straight to that. Audrey, I said. You were talking to your friends. There was no context being set. You said what you meant. I was venting. Everyone vents. You said I'm not the kind of man you build a future with. You said you're here until something better comes along. Those were your words. I heard them. She switched tracks then. So you're just going to throw away 2 years because of one conversation you half heard? I heard all of it. She tried a few more angles. Said I was being reactive. Said I was too old to understand how women talk to their friends. That one landed strangely. I'm too old to understand, but not too old to be useful to her in the meantime. Apparently. I told her I'd packed a bag with her essentials, toiletries, medications, a few days of clothes, and that it was on the front step. I told her she had 2 weeks to arrange collection of the rest of her belongings, and that I'd make sure she had access to do that with a friend present, but not alone in the house. You've already packed a bag, she said. I got up early. She stared at me for a moment. This is cruel. Trevor. My name is not Trevor. That's what she called me when she was trying to make a point. It was a habit she had using my full name, though everyone calls me by my nickname. It was always a small act of distance, and I'd never called her on it. What's cruel, I said, is what I heard last night. She left. Took the bag. I closed the door. The messages started about an hour later. That first day, it was mostly disbelief. I can't believe you're doing this. You're overreacting. Call me. By the second day, she'd moved into explanation mode. Long voice messages about what she really meant. About her complicated feelings. About how she'd been hurt before, and sometimes says things to protect herself. By the third day, it was her sister ringing from Napier. A woman I'd met twice, telling me that Audrey was devastated and that I needed to hear her out. I rang the sister back, actually, because I'm 64 and I've learned that ignoring something doesn't make it resolved. I told her exactly what Audrey had said. Word for word. Silence on the line. She said that? The sister asked. She did. In a restaurant, to her friends, at my retirement dinner. Another long pause. I'm sorry, she said. I didn't know it was like that. That's all right, I said. Now you do. I don't think she rang again after that. Rosalind came over 2 days after the dinner. She'd already heard most of it. She'd put things together that night from the look on my face, and I filled in the rest. She sat across from me at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a mug and didn't say anything for a bit. I never warmed to her, Dad, she said finally. I should have said something. You didn't have enough to say anything on. Neither did I. Did you love her? I thought about that honestly. I cared for her. I was comfortable with her. I might have convinced myself the rest would come. But no, Rosalind. I don't think it was love, and maybe that's part of it. She knew you were lonely. I think she knew I was stable, I said. There's a difference. By the end of the first week, I had a clear picture. Edmund had confirmed there were no legal complications. The house was mine. The accounts were mine. Nothing was shared. I transferred a small amount. I'd lent her early in our relationship. She'd asked to borrow it for a car repair, about $1,200, and sent her one message asking if she wanted to settle that, purely to close it out cleanly. She never replied to that one. Her belongings were collected on the Saturday, 9 days after the dinner. She brought a friend I'd never met before, a younger woman, who gave me a look like I was the villain of the piece. I greeted them both calmly. My neighbor Jeff was there with me, which I'd arranged beforehand, and I'd made a simple list of what was hers and what was mine. There was a minor moment over a lamp in the hallway. Audrey said she'd bought it as a gift for the house. Jeff, bless him, said quietly, if it was a gift, it was given. That makes it his. She didn't push it. As they were leaving, Audrey stopped in the doorway. She looked older than she had 2 weeks ago. Or maybe I was just seeing her differently. I did care about you, she said. Whatever you think. I believe that, I said. I also believe what I heard. She nodded once and left. I closed the door, put the kettle on, stood at my kitchen window, and looked out at the garden, which needed mowing, and thought, right, that's done. Update. 3 weeks later, the mutual friends, and there weren't many. We'd only been together 2 years, mostly faded out on their own once the story spread. One couple rang to say they thought I'd handled it rather abruptly, which is their right. I listened, thanked them for calling, and told them I didn't have any regrets about how I'd acted. They haven't rung again, which is also fine. Rosalind found out through someone that Audrey had been telling a version of events where I'd had a sudden breakdown at my own retirement dinner, become paranoid, and thrown her out without cause. The therapist she sees regularly apparently suggested she was dealing with abandonment triggered by transition anxiety, my retirement being the trigger, me being the problem. I don't say this with bitterness. I say it because it's fascinating, in a detached way, how people rewrite things. My retirement, which I worked 40 years for, became a psychological event that destabilized me. The things Audrey said out loud to people in a restaurant became a misunderstanding caused by my fragile state. I mentioned this to Edmund, and he just laughed. Classic Dad, he said. The narrative always has to go somewhere. Better you than her. The thing I've thought about most, though, isn't the dinner or the moving out or any of that. It's the months before. Looking back now, and I've had a lot of quiet evenings to look back, I can see the shape of things more clearly. The way Audrey would refer to our relationship as something temporary without seeming to realize she was doing it. While I'm here instead of now that I live here. If things work out, instead of when, I'd taken those phrases as caution, as someone who'd been hurt, being careful with language. I understand now they were just accurate. The way she'd subtly manage my time with my children. Not overtly, she was too smart for that. But plans that seemed to crop up whenever I was meant to see Edmund or Rosalind. Small comments about whether Rosalind was always this involved in your life. She'd laughed it off as a joke each time. I'd let it go. Over 2 years, I let a lot go. Jeff told me, after it was all over, that he'd noticed things too. Audrey would come and go from the house, at times that seemed odd. Once, a month or two ago, a car had sat outside for about 20 minutes and then driven off. He hadn't said anything because he wasn't certain, and it wasn't his business. You know, he said, sitting in my garden with a beer. She treated the place like it was temporary accommodation. He was right. She'd never really unpacked, kept half her clothes in bags in the wardrobe. I'd told myself it was because she was tidy, didn't want to spread out. It was because she was always, on some level, ready to leave. 6 weeks out now, and life is quieter. Genuinely quieter. I didn't realize how much low-level tension I'd been carrying until it was gone. I sleep well. I eat what I want, when I want. I've had Edmund and Rosalind over for Sunday dinner 3 times in the past month, and nobody has made a quiet comment about whether Rosalind asks too many questions about my finances or my health. I've started walking again in the mornings down to the waterfront and back, about 40 minutes. I used to do this before Audrey. I'd stopped without noticing. A bloke I know from the plumbing days rang last week to see if I'd heard about a tramping group that some of the retired fellas in the Bay had put together. Goes out twice a month. Nothing too strenuous. Just a few hours in the Caymanas or along the coast. I said I'd come along next time. It feels like I'm getting back to a version of myself that had been quietly shelved. I'm not angry with Audrey. I want to be clear about that. Anger would suggest I expected something different from what she was. But she showed me exactly who she was the moment she thought I couldn't hear her. People do that, they reveal themselves in the spaces where they think they're unobserved. The trouble is, most of us are too caught up in hoping we're wrong to really look. At 64, I've learned a few things I wish someone had told me clearly when I was younger. The first is this. Watch how people talk about you when they think you're not listening. Not in a suspicious way, not constantly, but pay attention. The version of you that exists in someone else's private conversations is often the most honest version they hold. The second is that stability is a gift some people will take without ever intending to give anything back. That's not always malicious. Sometimes people are just in survival mode, and you happen to be the solid ground they're standing on while they figure out their next step. But solid ground is still allowed to decide what it will and won't hold. The third, and this one took me the longest to learn, is that loneliness after loss can make you flexible in ways that aren't always good for you. When you've spent years being half of something, the pull to fill that space is strong. I was widowed at 58. I missed companionship. I missed having someone in the house. I accepted less than I should have because it felt like more than I'd had. That's worth examining, not with shame, but with clear eyes. The fourth, it is never too late to make a clean break. Not at 64. Not at 74. If something isn't what you thought it was, you're allowed to set it down. Your age doesn't mean you're obligated to keep carrying things that were never built to last. And the last one, perhaps the simplest. A quiet life with your own peace of mind is worth more than a full house held together by someone else's convenience. The harbor looks good this morning. Low tide, little bit of cloud moving off to the east. A few boats out past the island. I've got the kitchen window open and there's a tui somewhere in the garden having an argument with itself. I'm all right. More than all right. Actually, that's enough. I've had a lot of time to sit with all of this. Not brooding, just thinking. The way you do when the house is quiet and there's nothing pressing and the harbor is doing its thing outside the window. And what I keep coming back to isn't Audrey, or the dinner, or any of the 47 messages. It's the question of how I got there in the first place. I was widowed at 58. That's not an excuse. It's just a fact that matters. When you spend decades building a life with someone and then that person is gone, there's a hollowness that's hard to describe to anyone who hasn't felt it. And when something comes along that fills even a portion of that space, you can mistake warmth for depth. You can mistake convenience for connection. I did. I held on to something that was never fully mine to hold, because the alternative felt like admitting I was starting over alone. And at 62, that felt like a long road. What I understand now is that the hollowness was mine to sit with. Not to fill as quickly as possible, but to understand. Because when you rush to fill a space, you don't always notice what you're actually letting in. Audrey wasn't a cruel person. I want to be honest about that. But she made a choice, not once, but consistently, over 2 years, to take comfort and stability from someone she'd already privately written off. That's not a moment of weakness, that's a pattern. And patterns don't appear fully formed. They're built quietly, one small decision at a time, in the belief that nobody's really watching, but someone is always watching. Sometimes it's your neighbor. Sometimes it's your daughter, who reads a face better than any words you could offer her. And sometimes on a warm evening in a restaurant on the Strand, it's the person you thought couldn't hear you from the hallway. There's something I've come to believe about the way life tends to work, and it has nothing to do with fate or punishment or anything cosmic. It's simpler than that. It's just that the choices we make in private eventually find their way into the light. Not always dramatically, not always all at once, but they surface. The way you talk about people when you think they're not there, that's who you are. The way you treat someone's home, their time, their trust that leaves a mark, even if you never intended it to. For me, the act of walking out of that hallway and back to the table, of sleeping soundly that night, of ringing Edmund at 7:30 the next morning, with a clear head, none of that was bravery. It was just the result of finally seeing something plainly and deciding I wasn't going to talk myself out of what I'd seen. That's the only real courage I can claim. Not talking myself out of the truth because the alternative was uncomfortable. Rosalind asked me once, a few weeks after all this, whether I regretted the 2 years. I told her honestly that I didn't. Not because Audrey was right for me, she clearly wasn't, but because I learned something I needed to learn. At 64, I know now to pay attention to the quiet signals. To notice when someone says, while I'm here, instead of now that I'm here. To understand that stability offered freely is still something of value, and I'm allowed to decide who it's for. The morning walks are back. The Sunday dinners with my kids are back. The version of myself that had gone a bit quiet, that's coming back too. That's enough for me. It really is.